the question is around like, will serum become obsolete for cultivated meat? The answer is yes,
Hmm.
100%. Like, it's not something that people need to be worried about, in my opinion.
We just found the intro clip I'm going to put at the beginning of this, which is what you just said, that it's going to become
That's
obsolete.
fine. I'm happy to go on the record.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great. That's something that a lot of ethical vegans are certainly concerned with.
So, I mean, one of the advantages with cultivated meat is that you really just need one biopsy to feed the entire world.
So on the record, you're saying that one biopsy is capable of feeding the entire world if done in the specific way you just described.
Yeah, because I mean, it's an exponential function. I mean, if you go like,
Yeah.
when things double, you can get a very high numbers very quickly.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. So we are joined by Elliot Swartz, who is a PhD in neuroscience and who is trained in stem cell molecular biology. And we're here to talk to him about cultivated meat. And he is considered a principal scientist with respect to the subject. So he knows a lot more than me. And you guys have seen that I've been talking a bit more about cultivated meat of late and how I think there's a lot of potential there in regard to helping animals. And there's a lot of, unanswered questions that vegans have that I definitely haven't dived into on the channel. So I thought, why not bring somebody who's literally an expert in the topic to answer some of these questions. So Elliot, why don't you go ahead and just start by telling us, who you are, what you do, scientific background, even though I kind of just went into some of your training, but everything related to cultivated meat.
Sure. Well, yeah. First, thanks for having me on and to have this discussion. But yeah, my name's Elliot Swartz. I'm a principal scientist focused on cultivated meat at the Good Food Institute, which is a nonprofit that works to advance alternative protein technologies. So scientifically, my background and training is in neuroscience, but I did most of my work using stem cells to model neuromuscular disease. And so I spent a lot of time in graduate school making skeletal muscle tissue from human stem cells. And it was about, halfway through my PhD studies when I learned about cultured meats, where the first companies actually were founded and got some attention in the press. And I just thought that the idea was so, captivating and, from a scientific perspective, but also in terms of alignment about what I cared about from a value perspective with respect to, trying to address the challenges with animal agriculture. And so it was basically at that point forward around 2016 that I started following the industry quite closely. And after I graduated in 2018, I started work at GFI. So I've been really deeply trying to explore cultivated meat from a scientific perspective for the last 5 years. And I sort of summarized my role as thinking about, what are the technical and economic bottlenecks that are facing this industry, and what can we do about it from a scientific perspective, from a sort of getting people tackling certain challenges now so that they don't become problems 5 or 10 years down the road for advancing this technology.
Awesome. Well, that all sounds great. I mean, also for someone who's interested in animal rights and everything, I think that cultivated meat, if it gets brought to scale, will be the one thing that helps eradicate animal farming as a whole, or if not eradicate, largely diminish, just because you're literally getting like animal cell meat, but through like a much more ethical means, right? So I guess to start very simply, post introduction, can you explain to people just like what is cultivated meat? Just in the most simple of terms, like what is it and how is it made generally? I know there's multiple processes by different companies, but as a general kind of like way to describe it, how is it made?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, cultivated meat is basically genuine animal meat that's produced without the need to slaughter an animal. So essentially, the process starts by taking a small sample of cells from an animal. That animal could be living, or in some cases, it could be recently slaughtered, and that tissue is still viable. You basically take a small piece of tissue, and you can take that back to the lab, and then you would basically isolate or sort the cell types of interest. So you want cells that are capable of creating the muscle, the fat, and the connective tissue that makes up the meat products that people eat today. And so once you have those cells identified, the processes can really be thought of as two major steps. The first step is you grow these cells in a bioreactor, or what we sometimes commonly call a cultivator, in a liquid broth or a medium that contains all the nutrients that cells need to survive. So things like glucose, amino acids, vitamins, minerals, and water, essentially. And so these cells are, you can sort of envision it as being sort of like a brewery tank, where these cells are swirling around in a tank, multiplying by consuming these nutrients in the medium. And the goal of that first stage of the process is really to create as much tissue as possible, or as many cells as possible. So you're scaling up that process sort of consecutively in larger and larger vessels. And then the second part of the process is really about turning those cells into the principal components of meat. So the muscle, the fat, the connective tissue. You can then, sometimes do that in the presence of a scaffolding structure. So having those cells adhere to a structure that they can grow into and sort of, maybe create a tissue product like a whole cut piece of muscle meat. Or in some cases, you just take those cells directly. You can sort of combine them together and use other food processing techniques to create less structured products like ground meats, hot dogs, hamburgers, that sort of thing. So that's generally how most of the companies in this sector are approaching the production process.
Amazing. So it's kind of like taking what already happens in a cow, but and mimicking that process, but like through artificial means. In some way, it's not the same exact process, of course, but like taking cells and they're growing because of inputs of nutrients from what the cow consumes, but you're just doing it not on like a sentient life. You're doing it in a bioreactor or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the bioreactor is basically meant to replicate the conditions that you experience within the body. So it allows you as a manufacturer to have control of the process because, these control the pH, the temperature, it keeps things out of the vessel. So, other things don't get in. That all of those things have a high degree of control during the production process. But yes, you're fundamentally just, cells are cells, and they will grow inside the body or outside the body if the conditions are right.
It's interesting because a lot of people have this weird impulsive rejection of it in that, it's not natural or something. But from what you just said, it sounds like you're able to, through artificial means, have control over things that might actually be bad in a more natural case in which a muscle meat is being grown in a cow. So in that way, you can almost make the argument that the fact that this is artificial allows us to mitigate sort of the negative things that occur naturally within an animal, and optimize the good, and while creating the muscle meat.
Yeah, so I mean, there's probably the most clearest example of that has to do with like foodborne illness, and so you're fundamentally, you're not slaughtering an animal. You're not exposing that meat in the slaughterhouse to enteric pathogens like E. coli or Salmonella, Campylobacter, that sorts of things. So those things are very easy to control in a cultivated meat production process. That's a huge advantage, and also downstream in the future, especially, I think people are very interested in being able to tune the nutritional properties of the product based on how you feed those cells, like the composition of the media. So, you are what you eat. And so that enables you to have, I think, a lot of control of the downstream end product as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we'll talk a little later about the manipulation of like the macronutrient content of some of these foods and even other nutrients. So some of us have seen online claims that cultivated meat is made from cancer cells. Is there any truth to that claim? Where did it come from? Just what is your overall response to that?
Yeah, so I think people are going to try to poke holes in the new technology and scare the public about what they might be consuming if they're not well informed. But essentially, the cells that are used in cultivated meat production processes are highly proliferative. So that is basically where the comparison to cancer comes from, but that's also sort of where it falls apart, because beyond that, there's not too many similarities in terms of what's shared between cultivated meat cells and cancer. I mean, fundamentally, cancer tends to undergo a transformative process where it becomes sort of genetically unstable, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And that's exactly what you don't want for a reproducible
Right.
production process if you're trying to make meat over and over again. And so you actually wouldn't want to work with cells that are as uncontrollable as cancer in a food manufacturing process anyway. And so these things are actually largely screened out from the production process. I mean, there's various assays in terms of genomic stability that some of these manufacturers perform and submit that data to regulators. But it's mostly from a quality control standpoint that these concerns come into play. So, I mean, even if you were to be consuming cancer, it's actually not a food safety concern because those cells are dead when they're consumed. And actually, if you think about it, the enormous quantities of meat that the human population consumes every day, there's precancerous lesions in these tissues and that sort of thing. So people have been eating
Right.
cancer or precancerous cells for a very long time. They just don't really necessarily know about it. And that is to say that, I mean, it's not a food safety concern either. But I mean, in this case, the cells just aren't cancer
They're
anyway.
not cancer cells. Yeah. Yeah, we cover this on my channel and how there's there's a very specific criteria for something to be considered cancer, and cultivated meat does not meet that criteria, even if it just has this proliferative kind of trait. That's not enough to even consider it cancer. But that's interesting what you said, that people are already consuming a kind of preformed version of it already, but they're going to point at this, and it's also not even, it's also like a false claim, but also they already are doing something closer to that themselves with
which sort of makes it a little bit that's why it's a little bit absurd when you think about it from a concerns point of view.
No, totally. So have you seen the cultivated meat industry face any sort of resistance or like smear like campaigns from, I'm going to say from animal agriculture, but it could also just be from any sort of general body? And also, just what is the political culture like around cultivated meat?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic area. I mean, I spend a decent amount of time online, so I see different polarization in different communities. I mean, meat consumption, food consumption in general, I think is fairly tribalistic. It's fairly emotional. So people have very strong feelings when you are proposing a new way of food production, essentially. So in terms of like what I've been witnessing online, I mean, I think things are just like starting to occur when in terms of attacks. I don't necessarily think anything's like organized or anything like that. But I think it's more people have strong opinions of this, and so they're going to try to lift it up or disparage it equally. And so in today's world, misinformation and algorithms can control a lot of the information that you consume. And so I do think more and more as this technology begins to make its way onto the marketplace and people become more and more familiar, basically as it becomes more of a threat to the incumbent system and the way that we do things, that those things are likely to ramp up. But right now I'd say it's still early days, luckily, but I'll probably have to be doing a lot more, fighting disinformation as time moves on is what I anticipate.
Yeah, I'm sure as it becomes more and more of a competitor in practice, I mean, it just makes sense that the industries would feel more threatened and therefore start up more of these kind of smear-like campaigns. I would imagine that, like, not to make this a super political thing, but people that are largely conservative and are opposed to new things are going to have a sort of knee-jerk reaction to this, just because it's a new thing. It's like progressive by definition, and new things like this can sound very scary if you don't fully understand it, and it can seem unappealing if you're already a person who's predisposed to just dismiss new stuff and want things to be natural or the way things have always been, even though the animals we eat today aren't even natural, but that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah, and
But
I think that it comes up a lot in consumer research that's already been done and published. The term I think is they use is food neophobia, and so yeah, that's quite predominant. I think with this technology though, tasting will actually be believing, and when people bite into this product and realize that it's like basically indistinguishable from what they've been consuming, and then
Mhm.
you have consumer education on top of that where you say an animal didn't need to be slaughtered, it has these other benefits, that sort of thing. I mean, I hope that will be enough to make people start to sort of adopt the technology, and then you sort of let those adoption curves sort of take over, where you can see very fast shifts in consumer behavior with new technologies, even with food. I mean, in the United States, sushi used to be pretty disgusting to a lot of people, but now it's
Mm.
quite coveted. So that's one example that I think a lot of people use. When the counter argument is that food is not necessarily technology because it's so emotionally tied. But I think we have seen large shifts in food behaviors, just in the recent past, even.
Yeah, no, interesting. And of course, we can always point to health outcomes between foods considered natural and foods that are more artificial, like fortified cereals that contain B12 fortification, and see that this artificial food did a better job at increasing B12 levels in the bloodstream compared to this more natural food like pork, or I think it was in the paper I'm citing right now.
Mm.
And that's just like, okay, well, there's an example of an artificial thing or food being better with respect to a particular health outcome than a natural thing. So we shouldn't be looking at, the naturalness of a food to determine its health value. And that'll be good, I think, for people who are going to be opposing cultivated meat simply on the grounds that it's artificial,
Right. Yeah.
So this is kind of a funny question, but how would you convince somebody that cultured meat is not government sanctioned poison or some giant conspiracy started by Bill Gates with the goal of poisoning all of us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we're going to see more of this
Mm-hmm.
as time moves forward. But I mean, I guess at this stage, the conventional meat system is definitely more government backed than any alternative protein. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, we hope that some governments support the development of these new technologies in the future. But right now, the government has quite a far bit of more of a hand in the conventional system than
Mm-hmm.
in cultivated meat. But I mean, to answer your question, I think um, consumer education is going to be really important. I think making knowledge freely accessible is going to be really important. I think the manufacturers of these technologies, if you are publishing your data about your production process, you're literally showing people how the meat is made. You have that advantage here, where you, as a manufacturer trying to build a brand in this space, you can be very transparent about how you are producing the product. And actually, a lot of the companies in the sector say that for their production facilities, they'll have transparent walls inside of them, so you can actually go and visit a facility. You can see how the product is being produced. I think that will go a long way in
Mm-hmm.
sort of assuaging consumers' concerns about the new technology. Um, at the same time, I think we as a society in general have to do a little bit more in terms of reestablishing trust in institutions, some of which has been eroded away, especially during COVID. So, for
Yeah.
instance, there's a lot of skepticism about the FDA. When we say, okay, in the United States at least, for cultivated meat, the FDA and the USDA share regulatory oversight for the products, and so when I say, it's, sort of cleared by the FDA in terms of safety, as a scientist, that means a lot because I know how hard it is to get things through the
Yeah.
FDA.
Right.
But to a skeptic, that's like the worst thing you can say because
Right.
they're very prone to distrusting these sort of institutions. So, I mean, I don't know the answer of how that happens, but there does need to be some work, I think, at the higher level to sort of reestablish trust in these institutions, because ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of the products that people consume, a lot of the things that enter, the marketplace, they are regulated by quote unquote experts. And so at some degree, you have to trust the experts, which I know is, a problem that a lot of people have.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's also, there's a lot of goalpost shifting too, because I've seen people, be skeptical about certain products and be like, I don't even know what's in this. And then like, you'll link them the full transparent report of what's in it. Then they'll say, well, I don't trust them, so I don't think that's true. And then it's like, so how are we supposed to even get you on board with at least acknowledging that, like, what's in this, so that's another issue too. And I feel as though some people just aren't, they're kind of motivated, like they're maybe motivated reasoners, and there's no way in which they could even be shown information and believe that it's true if it's in favor of the thing that they currently are predisposed to not wanting to be good for them or think is not good for them, which is all very like, okay, well, let's move on to the next person who's a bit more honest and when given the appropriate information is willing to change their position. So I think that's definitely...
Yeah, that's how I generally treat it. And I think, it's the same thing with climate change. I mean, you can show people a bajillion graphs of evidence that's corresponding to, human-induced climate change and that sort of thing. Yet still online, these, conspiracy theorists and other naysayers just have a pretty strong voice. So it's definitely an uphill battle.
Yeah, we can hope that they're just a loud minority and move on to maybe the more hopefully reasonable majority that's going to be more open to these kinds of things. So there's apparently been recent attempts at banning cultivated meat in Italy. Have you heard of this? What are your thoughts on it? And have you seen this anywhere else, anything like this?
Yeah, I think, some of the more conservative governments tend to be protectionist over their, the conventional animal agriculture system. So I think, seen that in Italy come up. I haven't followed that as closely as maybe I should. My understanding is that it's been like passed in the Senate, but not necessarily like fully approved in whatever sort of their legislative process is. But we have my colleagues in Europe are sort of working with consultants there in Italy to understand the situation a little bit better and see what can be done about that. I think France is another country that is, has a very strong sort of food culture history and that sort of thing. So they tend to be, against, they're sort of famously the most against GMO in Europe. And they're, sort of protectionist against new technologies entering the food system. So that's another country of, I think, concern. But in general, most countries, I think, are still really taking the early steps to understand this technology around the world, especially regulatory agencies. So the FAO has coordinated a lot of meetings at the sort of governmental level, bringing in companies and other experts to educate regulators about the questions that they have for this technology. And that will go, a long way for helping them establish some frameworks to get these products onto the marketplace. Because I think, as we discussed before, there's going to be this inherent like knee-jerk reaction to like get it out of the system. But I think the more that we can introduce this technology and sort of just normalize it and get people to realize that, there's a lot of advantages, and not a lot of concerns, hopefully, that the tides will start to turn. But yeah, definitely Italy, France, Argentina, maybe I think is going to be another country that has a strong agricultural system. Anywhere with a strong sort of agricultural lobbies in place, I think is something to be concerned about in the long term.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because although there's like heritage in these places too in regard to foods, it's just like, well, sorry, but the way in which your food is produced has XYZ problems. We have this alternative that can solve for XYZ problems while still allowing you to eat the dishes you like. It's just the meat comes from a different means. So why not consider that? And for them, it's just like you said, there's lobbying, of course, and financial incentives, but just putting that aside and just thinking about the whole like my culture kind of thing or my heritage and all that being put before like progress and like providing like good outcomes for the whole world is just unfortunate and quite bizarre to me. Even if you're attached emotionally to these cultural things, we all know even with vegan foods today, you can get vegan versions of foods that apply to specific cultures, and it's all while reducing your environmental footprint, helping animal rights. So hopefully, I just wish that cultivated meat can take the same form for these people, but who knows, right? So I want to talk now about economic viability. So many people, because I did a little survey for my followers and told them I was going to have you on and asked them what questions they had. And many of them were basically asking, when do you have an estimate of when cultivated meat can be considered economically viable to the point that it's in stores and financially competing with traditional animal products? And I'll even say not even like competing equally, but maybe even it's a little more expensive, like we see with some vegan mock products today. But so what do you have any sort of estimate on that?
Yeah, so I think it's this question is complex and definitely still in the early days in terms of understanding the full sort of economic viability picture, I'd say. It's also it's important to consider what product you're talking about. It's going to be easier to compete with a bluefin tuna sushi than it is with chicken. And also there's this whole concept now of hybrid products where similar to electric vehicles, the cost of the battery was, is basically too high to have a fully electric vehicle 15, 20 years ago. And so they, met you halfway with a hybrid vehicle. And that was, meant to introduce these technologies to, a broader set of consumers at a lower price point. And so similar strategies being taken in this industry where, the cost of production today is pretty high. But we can use those animal cells to add, good functional properties to otherwise plant-based meat products at varying percentages. So just in case your audience is not aware, like the product on the market in Singapore from the company Good Meat, those tend to be around 70% animal cells and the rest are plant-based ingredients. The company Upside Foods that has a product in a restaurant in San Francisco is actually almost all 99% animal cells. But a lot of companies are looking at hybrid products at lower percentage of cultivated cells, basically using them as ingredients. Especially if you're just making fat, you might be able to add those at very low percentages, 5, 10% or less or something like that. So just sort of say that to set the stage. But to answer your question directly, I think, we don't know the actual cost of cultivated meat today. Like I can't just give you a number, and that's because it's still in a pretty early phase of development. The scales are small and there's not a lot of like transparency in terms of, what actual production processes and raw materials people are sourcing out and their costs associated with that. I basically say that, based on some of the models that have been performed, as well as just having general sort of insider knowledge on scientific progress in the industry, that it's likely the cost of production for some of the companies that are sort of leading the way to make like a 100% animal cell product is, probably somewhere still between $100 to $1,000 a kilogram would be my guess. If someone claims they can produce it lower than that, I'd have to like independently verify the model and look into it, but I just haven't had that opportunity yet. So I think, that just to put that in perspective, the number that a lot of people cite is that the first burger that was created actually a decade ago cost about $300,000 because it was all done by hand, etc. So we've seen actually really dramatic cost decreases for the production. That mostly comes from sourcing the media ingredients. So switching from like a pharmaceutical supply chain to more of a food supply chain for that, and you can get very large cost decreases very quickly, and we've seen that in the industry. So I think the way that I've thought about this as well, and obviously the business strategy for some of these companies differs, but if you actually look at like the premium meat market globally, it's about 6 million metric tons in volume annually, which is a very large amount. Because we're currently producing as an industry more on the sort of kilogram scale than the ton scale as of right now. And so I think there's going to be quite a bit of opportunity for companies to compete with more premium meat products at higher price points in the short term, and sort of gain a foothold in the marketplace, develop a viable business model, and then learn by doing, get better at manufacturing, and have the technology advance over time. We've sort of seen this with a lot of newer technologies like, solar panels, et cetera. So I think that's generally what, the trajectory is. What we'll see with, over the next few years, it'll just be in restaurants, because the scale is going to be pretty small. But companies have already started to break ground on larger scale facilities that can produce millions of pounds a year, theoretically. And so I think we'll be able to see those sorts of volumes being produced toward the latter stages of this decade. And when you're talking about competing with like commodity meats, like just, chicken, pork, ground beef, etc., I don't think that's really going to happen, anytime soon before the end of this decade. And in order for that to occur, I think, we're going to have to really reach a lot of, turn up the knobs in terms of efficiency and what we can do, scale up quite a bit. And that's going to take a lot of time and capital. But you're also probably going to need sort of coincident increases in meat prices rising and/or other like incentive mechanisms for cultivated meat to compete in the marketplace, like low interest loans being guaranteed by the government to sort of build new facilities, other tax incentives, other subsidies, etc., that you see with most mature industries. You sort of need, I think we'll need that to lift up this industry, and have it be competitive. I mean, we see that with electric vehicles and other technologies as well. So it's nothing out of the realm of possibility and what already happens. It's just it's going to take some time.
Gotcha. Do you think, just a question that came into my mind, and don't worry if you don't have any of the calculations on hand, but if all of the government subsidies toward animal agriculture were to just disappear, I mean, I'd imagine that the time at which cultivated meat would compete financially with them would be a lot sooner. What do you think about something like that happening? Obviously, that's probably not going to happen, but I'm just thinking because one of the reasons that meat isn't as expensive as it should be is because of these subsidies. So
yeah, I think people ask us that a lot, and from an organization perspective, GFI doesn't really try to take away the subsidies of the conventional animal agriculture industry. But one of the reasons for that is that it's right now it's currently politically intractable. But the other reason is really that if you average out the subsidies over like the price of every chicken breast and whatever that you buy in the store, the price difference is only actually like a few cents, to my knowledge. I haven't. This is like secondhand information, but that's what I've heard. And so because we just produce so much meat, those subsidies get spread out and dispersed quite a bit. Where the actual price difference that you'd see at the store is only a couple of cents. But obviously, it would help. But I think other things are going to probably get us there faster with just sort of market dynamics and shifts in terms of like company incentives that we see sort of going on in the energy space right now, where assets become stranded because other technologies are being more invested in, that sort of thing. So those sorts of dynamics, I think, have to start to happen with the alternative protein technologies versus the conventional animal agriculture industry. And once that gets going, it's sort of like a positive feedback loop that occurs.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, all very interesting. So how about in regards to things like emissions, land use, and water use? Like, how does cultivated meat compare? We'll say maybe just start with beef, and then if you have information on other things like chicken and pork, we can go into that too. And also, I know that there's different processes for each company, but yeah, so just in the most general sense, how do those things measure out?
Yeah, so this is an area that I've sort of worked in for the past couple of years, and there's a study that we funded and that I helped to co-author that tries to basically build a model of a generic cultivated meat production process, what that would look like at scale, basically by the end of this decade is how we try to model it out. And that's actually based on talking to several companies that are manufacturing cultivated meat, but also supply chain companies, getting actual data from them and, sort of building that into a model that we think takes into account, all of the major factors that one would need to consider. So I jotted down some numbers for this question just to cite like the actual outcomes of that study. But I mean, ultimately, these numbers are going to be slightly different depending on maybe where you are in the world, what you're comparing to, et cetera. But, for beef, which is the worst offender in terms of environmental impact, if you're cultivating meat instead of just making conventional beef, you'd use a roughly 90% less land, 66% less water, and about 92% fewer emissions. And that number for emissions is specifically when both of those are equally produced using renewable energy. And compared to pork, the numbers are about a 67% reduction in land use and 44% reduction in emissions. And for chicken, it's about 64% reduction in land and about equivalent in greenhouse gas emissions. The important thing to realize for this study is with those conventionally produced products, we're actually comparing to like near the best of the best. So we're being very sort of generous in terms of the comparison for conventional meat and a little bit conservative for cultivated meat. And so as a whole, I think the takeaways here like that I think people need to understand about cultivated meat is that the production process is more efficient. And so if you look at feed conversion ratio, basically how many calories of feed does it take to get 1 calorie of food out? For chicken, the number is about 9 to 1. And so that tends to be the most efficient form of meat production. The rough calculations for cultivated meat suggest that it could be around like 3 to 1. So nearly 3 times as efficient. And that efficiency basically translates to a lot less land needed to grow crops that are going to be used to feed the cells in this case, which means fewer fertilizers are needed, fewer pesticides are needed, etc. And so those sort of knock-on benefits from land use means that you also have large reductions in air and water pollution, since a lot of that is caused by nitrogen-related emissions from fertilizer, manure, nutrient runoff, etc. So those sorts of findings in terms of land use, water and air pollution reduction, those are expected to be really robust, advantages for cultivated meat technology. With emissions, you do use more energy for cultivated meat production. But again, the important thing here is that you're essentially electrifying the production process, and therefore you can run the production process on renewable energy. And so most of the emissions are what we call scope 1 and 2 emissions, which means that they're emissions that occur and released at the facility itself. And that means the manufacturer of cultivated meat will have a lot of control over those emissions. So they can install renewable energy capacity at their facility by building solar panels, or they can build their facilities in regions where renewable energy is abundant. Of course, that will be more abundant as time moves forward when this industry is scaling up. That is not the same case for the conventional meat industry, where the majority of emissions occur throughout the supply chain. They're what we call scope 3 emissions. So there's a lot more players involved. You need a lot more sort of coordination to reduce those emissions in order to actually make marginal gains in emissions reduction, because there's also more greenhouse gas types that are emitted for conventional meat. So you have methane, you have land use change, you have nitrous oxide, etc. But with cultivated meat, it's primarily carbon dioxide that is driving the emissions, and that's just a lot more controllable.
Got you. Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like environmentally it's significantly better. And it's funny because, yeah, you're being very charitable with the assumption in the model that animal agriculture resorts to 100% renewable energy, which is not the case today. And still, cultivated meat wins out, which my followers know, but yeah, animal agriculture in terms of just efficiency is one of the most like inefficient things we practice globally. So this would be so great just from a perspective of like reducing land use, water use, and emissions. So this question is kind of specific. So to your knowledge, what is the largest bioreactor currently being used successfully to produce cultivated meat, and what is its yield?
Yeah, so we did actually an industry survey last year to get a sense of where the industry is at in terms of their scale. And so we are actually writing a report right now that will summarize some of that data. But essentially, the largest bioreactor that, to my knowledge, is installed in any production facility is about 6,000 liters. That's the one in Singapore by the company Good Meat. But to my knowledge, it's not yet operational. So they're not necessarily producing meat out of it yet. They have to still sort of scale into that. In general, most of the leading companies are working in about 1,000 or 2,000 liter bioreactors. I'd have to do some back of the envelope math, but we don't know the actual yield per se that companies are getting. We do have a few numbers on that, but they're a little bit they're highly variable in terms of what we've collected thus far. So I think it's still a bit in the discovery phase with respect to yield and everything. But yeah, in terms of scale, 1,000, 2,000 liter reactors is where a lot of the leading companies are at.
Gotcha. Okay, no, sounds terrific. I mean, definitely we need some more time to get more like absolute answers there. Okay, so I have some questions here related, let's just say, animal ethics. So I'm sure you know that fetal bovine serum is used in the production of cultivated meat. So could you just explain how exactly that typically goes down, and I guess what it is for the viewers that don't even know what it is?
Yeah, so fetal bovine serum is actually what it's pretty descriptive in the name, but essentially, this is serum that is taken from the fetus while it's still in a pregnant calf. And essentially, what happens is when dairy calves go for slaughter, there's a low percentage of them that are still pregnant when they're in the slaughter line. Those calves are identified, and then the FBS is sort of taken from them. So it's actually a byproduct of the dairy industry. And FBS has been being used in cell culture since I think the 1950s is when people first started to use it. And I think it just sort of grew with the the growth of the dairy industry and meat industries in general. So it's sort of weird that it's this remnant of cell culture that it just makes things easier. So, I mean, if you think about it from a biology perspective, you're taking basically the fluids that are bathing cells that are meant to like be fast dividing and replicative in an early embryo or fetus. And so when you add that to the nutrient medium that cells are growing in, they just really like it. Like it's something that can be used to basically grow any cell type pretty efficiently and reproducibly. And so it's just been sort of a mainstay in cell culture since then. And we can talk about if that's changing or not. But I think in general, it's sort of funny that these questions come up in the context of cultivated meat. It was just sort of funny to me because basically like the pharmaceutical industry is what uses FBS. Like if you look at, from a volume perspective, cultivated meat is still so small that it's not like a user of FBS on a global perspective. I mean, the graduate students at Harvard or like, MIT or whatever, probably combined use more FBS than most cultivated meat companies combined at this point in time. So it's just sort of funny. So we can talk about where we are in terms of moving away from that.
That was, so that's interesting. So the amount is really not that much, I guess. In terms
it's also important for people to understand like this is a byproduct of the industry, and actually the profits for FBS go to the slaughterhouse, which means that there's actually no incentive for dairy manufacturers to increase their herd sizes in the hopes that they're going to get a payout from FBS. So the supply of FBS is actually quite fixed. It's very like not growing. But the demand has been increasing, especially with the incoming like cellular therapeutics industry and the growth of the biopharma sector, et cetera. So the prices have risen very dramatically, like over 3 times in the past 10, 15 years. So it's a very expensive product, and that's not likely to change anyway. So there's a lot of incentive to, I think, move away from FBS just from an economic standpoint. Nevertheless, the ethical issues as well.
Yeah, so I guess I was going to ask, because you're saying it's also expensive, so there's obvious like incentive there to get away from it, aside from just the ethical reasons. So do you think FBS will eventually become obsolete? Do you know of any alternatives that aren't used, globally now, but could be as a replacement?
Yeah. So the other side of this is that a lot of cell culture has been done serum-free also for decades as well. So we know how to grow cells without serum. In my graduate school work, I worked with a specific type of cell, and we didn't use serum at all. I barely ever used it. And some people think it's like a necessity for cell culture. It's not. I just want to make that clear, because a lot of people have that sort of misunderstanding. The second thing is that, there's a lot of alternatives on the market that have been created, and most companies, if they've been around for a while, they're off of serum for sure. Like there's published papers on this, there's patents, you can go look it up. I mean, serum is not a bottleneck for this industry, and it actually never was, in my opinion. It's just a short-term thing that when you're culturing these cells that no one's ever cultured before, to the same extent that we've done for other cell types, like human cells, for instance, you have to start somewhere. You have to get those cells to grow, and so you have to use serum. But actually getting off of serum, it's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's also not the hardest. Like, it's not rocket science to remove serum from cell culture media. The more challenging part is actually making a media that's as productive as a serum containing media. So can you get the performance out of the cells that you want? And according to company survey data that we collected, many companies are actually seeing similar or even better performance in serum-free media than serum-containing media, because you're going to a further extent of optimization here. Is basically what the direction that companies are moving in towards. So, the question is around, like, will serum become obsolete for cultivated meat? The answer is yes, 100%. Like, it's not something that people need to be worried about, in my opinion.
Great. Okay, so we just found the intro clip I'm going to put at the beginning of this, which is what you just said.
That's fine. I'm happy to go on the record.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's something that a lot of ethical vegans are certainly concerned with. I was going to ask, is most of the meat one of those companies that have a serum-free media? Because I read that they do, but it hasn't passed a regulatory approval yet.
Yeah, so this is another thing that people, like, why there's still a little bit confusion over this topic, because essentially the products that were approved in the United States, they still use serum, or they have the optionality. Actually, Upside Foods FDA documentation says, they have submitted serum-free and serum-containing processes. But you have to realize that with these initial approvals, they're basically snapshots in time of about 3 to 4 years ago. Basically what you're getting here is the process started 4 years ago. And if you want to create a get a product on the market that's serum-free, you had to have had a fully serum-free process established, because if you replace different ingredients in the media, you basically have to go through the regulatory approval process again. And so it's just that these companies wanted to, get the FDA moving on this issue. They wanted to get the FDA prepared. They wanted to get products to the market. They wanted to, for people to realize that this technology is real, et cetera. So some companies, they decided to go to market with, serum-containing media. But this is going to be a very, very, very small, minuscule percent of the cultivated meat that is ever manufactured. Because basically, my guess is that by the end of this year, actually, in the United States, you'll see a serum-free media product approved by one of the companies. And so basically every product that comes to the market in the coming years, virtually every product would be my guess that it will be serum-free. It's just, it's going to take a little bit of time to catch up. with the regulatory process is pretty long.
That's great. Yeah. Sorry, is Mosa Meat one of those companies? I just wanted to.
Oh yeah. So they're one of the companies that has published a lot on serum-free. They have protocols of muscle production and fat production all in serum-free media. So yes, they're one of the companies that has published on that, but there's a lot that haven't published on it that are also serum-free.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, I was going to ask if there's any companies you think that will be completely free from serum, but that seems to be answered. It seems likely that's going to happen. Now, what about the use of animal products, period? Is there, because I know you have to extract cells in the first place from either an egg or a chicken or whatever. Is there any conceivable way to generate cultivated meat without any animal products? Or do you think, at least given your knowledge at the moment, you're always going to need an animal cell? Like, I don't know, if someone asks, like, could you cultivate meat from previously cultivated meat from another animal? That's not how it...
Well, yeah, I mean, essentially, one of the advantages with cultivated meat is that you really just need one biopsy to feed the entire world, because the cells that your people are using are, you want them to be immortalized. They're called an immortalized cell line. This is also why people get it sort of mixed up with cancer, because cancer is also immortal. But so basically, most companies in the sector are using cell lines, which means they proliferate indefinitely. That means that cell, as long as you keep growing it and keep freezing it back in vials, you can pull from that, in perpetuity. So you don't have to go back to the animals. So, but of course you need to get those cells. You do need to start with an animal, but again, it can be like a single biopsy, and that's not like a lie or anything like that. It's actually what happens quite a bit of time. I mean, it can be sometimes hard to get what we call like a cell line to just sort of like spontaneously grow indefinitely. But nevertheless, it happens a lot, and companies have large banks of these cells that they can go back to. Different companies do take different strategies. So there are some companies, like Mosa Meat is actually one of them, that will go back to the animal and biopsy the animal, and then sort of sort the cells out and then put them directly into the production process. So that strategy can be taken, where you basically have a small herd of animals that you're going to be biopsying again. And I think some people just sort of view that as sort of keeping the tradition alive and that sort of thing. But ultimately, I think the meat that people will be consuming when it comes to cultivated meat will be from just a single cell line from various different species that was acquired over time, that won't require the use of keeping animals.
That's super interesting. I mean, so on the record, you're saying that one biopsy is capable of feeding the entire world if done in the specific way you just described.
Yeah, because I mean, it's an exponential function. I mean, if you go when things double, you can get a very high numbers very quickly. So I mean, but that's how we understand it. Like, a cell line that is functionally immortal will reproduce in perpetuity, and so that's interesting. That going forever.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we've all, like, vegans can be very roughly against any sort of animal use whatsoever, and there's a lot of like the philosophy side of the vegan community that they've asked questions like, well, if you could extract a biopsy or whatever from an animal, and it was capable of ending the entire animal agriculture industry, just hypothetically, right, would you do it? And of course, vegans that are opposed to any animal use ever would have to say no. But for vegans that are, in my view, a bit more, reasonable, are going to be like, well, yeah, we already take biopsies from animals that are sick to help that animal. So why would we not want to take a biopsy from this cow to potentially save all future cows from being farmed and killed and whatnot? So if you're saying that one extraction of cells can do that in theory or whatever, like that's amazing. And I would hope that there's going to be companies that adopt that process, so they're not having to continuously use animals for their cells in the first step of the process. So that's
Yeah,
great.
like I said, that's basically the norm. I think also just to add some more like layers of context here that people might be interested in. So you can take a biopsy itself is pretty can be pretty small. Like it literally like the size of I say like the size of an eraser head. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
you can imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about that on even a chicken, a pig, a cow, etc. I mean, it's pretty harmless procedure. They can go live their life after that.
Mm-hmm.
It depends also. I mean, you might in some cases the animal could be like under anesthesia, depending on where you're getting that biopsy, like how deep, etc. But there's various different biopsy locations that one can use.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, that animal goes and lives its life. I think the exception is that if the cells are being acquired from like very small juvenile animals, like a juvenile fish or like a shrimp or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, then just the amount of cells that you need versus the size of the animal probably will end up like killing the animal or you're sacrificing the animal during that
Okay.
procedure. But again, I think one if you can just spare one fish to get cells that will divide in perpetuity, I think the equation is balanced very strongly in the right direction. The other important I think thing for people for cell lines is that there's been some news recently about cultivated meat being considered halal or not, and
Mm-hmm.
so that has to do with uh, essentially acquiring the cells from a slaughtered animal. So if the animal is already being slaughtered in a halal method and you acquire that, you just take a biopsy, after the animal's dead, but the tissue is still viable. So,
Mm-hmm.
there's not enough, it hasn't died yet, essentially, the tissue. You can take the cells from that and then make cultivated meat out of that. And then it would be, considered halal if there's no serum involved in the production process, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So there are instances where, to create certain types of religious certifications, they may require animal slaughter. But again, if you have a cell line, you just really need one biopsy
Yeah.
that works well. So it's really from an animal welfare perspective. I mean, I think it's like a slam dunk technology.
Yeah.
There's always going to be some. You can't have like complete perfection, but I mean, I think it's a pretty good system with a lot of advantages.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly you can make an argument that a painless biopsy, at the very least, generating, I'm going to use the word infinite, but like a lot of meat, and you never need to do it again. And if it's for the rest of the time that there's even demand for meat products, that you would want to do that over allowing animal agriculture to exist as it does today. That seems a bit obvious to me. And
I would hope so. Yeah.
yeah. And I'm not that I'm not Muslim or anything, but I have read a little bit into like what makes for something to be halal and stuff. And there's some vegans I know who are just they're Muslim and they just turn vegan because when you look at all the investigations into like halal, there's a lot of like animals that just straight up were from factory farms anyway. And part of the teachings in Islam that basically say like eat halal involve treating the animal well, not just during slaughter, which that alone to me is a bit contradictory, but whatever. But also prior to slaughter. So you can't just have a factory farmed animal and then slaughter them in a halal way and say that's halal meat, because the animal needed to be treated respectively prior, and obviously in a factory farm they're being anything but respected. So there's also that issue. So it might just be easier for maybe like Muslims to get cultivated meat from these sources where they just got a biopsy and that was it, and there wasn't a slaughter. I don't know. It depends on the interpretation, and religion can be very subject to interpretation. But just wanted to say that as well. Find it very interesting.
Yeah.
So you kind of answered this next question, which is, do you know what typically happens to animals that we get cells from, and or animals whose eggs are used for cells? And it says, how do they obtain them? We kind of already know that, biopsy. And how much discomfort does the animal experience? So yeah,
I think it really depends on the cell type that you're being looking into. Like For you can literally take like a cheek swab or a blood draw, and you could use those cells. You can turn them into what's called an induced pluripotent stem cell, which are again those are immortalized
Yeah,
cells
yeah.
that would
Hmm.
replicate indefinitely.
Hmm.
But some companies want to work directly with like adipose tissue, or that sort of thing. So it depends on what cell type you're going. But yeah, generally there's local anesthesia applied. There's it's done under veterinary supervision, under protocol. So most of a lot of researchers in the sector, since cell lines still aren't like very available, I'd say we still need broader availability of cell lines where like a researcher can go to a cell bank and purchase a vial of cells. That's still sort of being developed, but
Mm.
universities and research labs will partner with veterinary schools to acquire biopsies because a lot of these schools have like farm animals and that sort of thing. So that's generally how a lot of lines are created these days. With seafood, it's a little bit more complicated. Heard stories of people literally going out on the ocean and catching a tuna and taking a biopsy from the tuna and putting it back in the ocean.
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
it's sort of like how it's been done since some of these animals that we want to make cultivated meat and seafood from aren't as abundantly accessible.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and then eggs is another one that I think eggs are really early stage cells, and so they're highly proliferative and they have a lot of good properties. So that's where a lot of people I think look for acquiring some of their cells. And again, I think it depends. In most cases, I think if you're going to take from an actual egg, I don't know this for sure, but my guess is that you'd probably sacrifice the egg or the embryo. There
Hmm.
are ways, obviously, to get embryonic stem cells out of a developing blastocyst. That's literally like a microscopic ball of cells, but
Hmm.
you need pretty sophisticated instrumentation. That's like how they do IVF, essentially. And I don't think most companies are probably not doing that with their, acquiring cells from a fish egg, for instance. They're probably just using the whole fish egg.
Got you. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess I would hope, especially for if vegans ever get interested in this. Obviously, if they purchase from a company that did the one biopsy and then they were able to produce endlessly, like there's not going to be much problem there because your purchase isn't going to put in demand any future biopsies that could result in some amount of animal suffering or rights violations. But I guess in the case of buying from a company that is continuously using them, they're going to want to know what exactly is being done to these animals afterward and all of these things. But okay, that's interesting. So I guess with this, it's the same thing with establishing or looking at like health outcomes of like plant-based meat. Like there's just so many different companies, so many different products that you can't really make a blanket statement for a lot of the answers to these questions. So it's just gonna have to depend. And I guess people, when this stuff is brought to scale, they're gonna have to do their own research and see how.
Yeah, I
animals
think
are,
I think if people have that concern, there's hopefully the companies will have that transparency attached to the origin of their cells, because it for sure needs to be documented from a regulatory process. It's actually very important. So companies will have that information.
right. Yeah, it's kind of refers back to what we talked about earlier, where people want transparency, but maybe they'll receive it and not believe it. And at that point, it's like, what are we supposed to say to you? Sorry. um, okay, yeah, I was going to ask, I guess, how many samples are needed to sustain a cell line, but that's already been answered. And so I guess we can talk about two companies. So you've heard of O-Meats, right? So they claim to not use fetal bovine serum, but instead plasma from cows that they have rescued and have in sanctuaries. So they've rescued them from the industry, and they take their plasma each week, and they use that as an alternative to FBS. So have you heard of this and the process? What do you think of it, and is it scalable?
Yeah. So essentially, what they do is they harvest, I think, plasma from the animal,
Mm-hmm.
and the plasma contains platelets that are rich in growth factors, essentially. So those are floating around in your blood right now. They're floating
Mm-hmm.
around in any animal blood. And actually, this idea of using platelet lysates is not new at all. So, I
Okay.
mean, we use that actually all the time. Not all the time, but It's used abundantly in other cell culture processes. Actually, human platelet lysate is, you can go and buy that from life science companies, and actually adult cow platelet lysate as well. So you can actually go buy that right now from not O Meat, but other companies sell that too. So the idea is not new. It's just that it's sort of interesting that a cultivated meat company is tying together this sort of like regenerative ranching story and keeping animals for this purpose. So I think in general, this is a way to grow cells effectively without FBS, which I think is good. And I think you ask about like scalability and viability. I don't know the actual numbers in terms of like how this influences the cost of the media and the overhead cost of raising the animals and keeping them, etc. But in the end, my assumption is that fully serum-free plant-based media, let's say, or media that has recombinant proteins in it at low costs, will ultimately end up more affordable. It's probably likely the case that this methodology can be more affordable right now and in the short term, because the supply chain for all of these other ingredients that we're going to need for the future sort of cultivated meat industry, that's not scaled up yet. And so with scale comes cost reduction. And so I don't think we haven't bottomed out in terms of like where we need to be for cost reduction for the cell culture media. And this is one way to, I think, sort of get there a little bit faster in the short term. That's my overall sort of interpretation of this strategy.
Yeah, interesting. It seems intuitive to think too that like over time the plant inputs are going to be more affordable than like these animal inputs that require, taking care of a whole animal on top of all these other things, as opposed to just extracting these plant inputs from just plants that you grow or crops that you grow.
Yeah, I think in general, there's a lot of different ways to manufacture, like do this process. So I think we're going to see like you were saying before, like there's a lot of different options and strategies available, and we're going to see some variance there. And so I think, like you said, I think if consumers are concerned about that particular methodology, then hopefully they can make the choice. But I think either way, there's not like a massive. I think when people read that, I think they were concerned is like, oh well, if this is the way that we're going to do this, then we're going to there's going to be vampire cows spread across the world now instead, or something. But I don't think like it's that much of an advantage where like it would just totally dominate the marketplace. Let's say. So it's not like everything's going to consolidate to this, because there's a lot of other ways to go about it.
Gotcha. Okay, and now I guess we'll talk on that article I mentioned to you over email. So there was an article recently on Upside Foods, which is one of the two companies who was recently who recently got approval from the FDA to sell cultivated meat. And the title was, quote, "Insiders Reveal Major Problems at Lab-Grown Meat Startup Upside Foods." And in summary, I read the whole thing. It said, the number one, fetal bovine serum is not the only animal product being used. They also use gelatin. And number two, they are further from scaling their product than they had previously insinuated. So you told me you read this article. Like, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so they're actually, the Wall Street Journal reported on a similar sort of story, especially with regards to the scaling concerns a couple months previously. So it wasn't too new. I guess for your audience to understand too, like I have some information that is not publicly available, but in general, I don't know everything that goes on to each and every one of these companies. It's just sort of not what they wouldn't tell me anyway, and it's just not within like my bandwidth to actually understand. So I have things at a more broad level of understanding. But with regard to the specific things you mentioned, so as I was talking about previously, Upside Foods, they submitted their documentation to the FDA for a structured chicken product that's currently for sale in a San Francisco restaurant. And if you actually look at the picture, it's actually quite convincing. Like, it looks exactly like a raw chicken breast. It's
Mm-hmm.
basically 99% chicken cells. And certainly this is not the easy way to do things. And so essentially what that article shares is that they are currently manufacturing that at very small scales using what are called roller bottles that are basically 2 liter bottles.
Mm-hmm.
So very tiny amounts of tissue are being grown in these bottles, and they're sort of being combined together to create that product at really low throughput. And they built bioreactors that were supposed to be able to scale that custom process essentially. And I guess they've struggled to do that, according to that article, as well as according to a blog post that Upside recently published, I think last week, in response to the article. So the doing that hard thing and going to market with that hasn't been as successful, I think, as they maybe wished. But that was also part of their strategy overall, because in this blog post they basically say, like, we wanted to like go to the moon right away. We didn't want to
Mm-hmm.
just go to low orbit, or so they thought they would learn a lot from that process, which they say they have.
Mm-hmm.
In parallel, also what's being done at Upside is the easier way of doing things, which is just growing cells up and using them as ingredients in hybrid products to create like ground products. And so that product, they say in their blog that that's at 2,000 liter scale. And they initially they announced a new facility to scale up that production process that will be outside of Chicago. So that's sort of the process that they're really truly going to go to market with.
Mm-hmm.
And so the scaling concerns, hopefully, I think they'll continue to work on that, and hopefully
Mm-hmm.
they'll be resolved. But that's, sort of one of the key points. The other point that you mentioned was on gelatin and other animal ingredients in the process. I think, as I mentioned before, these are mentioned in the FDA
Mm-hmm.
filings. So they did mention a couple things, like as well as albumin from in terms of like animal components that are used in the process. I
Mm-hmm.
think albumin is still being used from bovine. But like I said before, I think I I would not be concerned about this. Like, there's a lot of like alternatives to these things already. It's just about incorporating them into the process and resubmitting that information to the FDA. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
lag time between those things from occurring.
Mm-hmm.
And so, similar to FBS, gelatin can be used to basically help cells adhere to things. So if you want cells to attach to things, you can coat it in gelatin. But yeah, there's a lot of other alternatives to that, and so that I think will be solved in the
Cool.
very short term.
Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds like right now there's just a lot of there's a lot of things that time will just figure out with new innovations and such. And right now there's these middle ground kind of solutions and things like the plasma from O meat and stuff. But over time, these things will also probably become more obsolete, and these alternative methods that'll be cheaper will be like more used than the other things. So that's good. That seems to be the general theme here with some of these like middle ground solutions that are still maybe using some animal inputs. So
yeah, I think what I hope will happen too is that a lot of the innovation in cultivated meat will hopefully trickle down into other industries as well, actually, because like I said, FBS is pretty high cost, and
Mhm.
researchers in academia that are just doing other biomedical research would much rather not pay for FBS if they
Yeah.
had the option to. So a lot of these alternatives that are being developed in the cultivated meat industry, I hope will be sold eventually and accessible, like in large quantities and accessible to other researchers, and actually sort of flip this whole marketplace where the majority of cell culture is done serum free versus serum containing. Actually, I think that's the case today. I mean, a lot of like, if you're making antibody drugs and things like that,
Mhm.
and you're using animal cells, most of that's done serum free in terms of the actual industry. So
Mhm.
on a volumetric basis, I think we're already sort of over the hump. Like, peak serum
Mhm.
has been sort of predicted for a while, and it's sort of moving down with time to where most animal cell culture everywhere is done serum free. I think that is the future state. but the cultivated meat industry and some of the innovations that are going on, I think we're going to lead that and make it faster than it otherwise would occur.
Yeah, great. So in some way, the cultivated meat industry might fuel or increase the likelihood of serum-free options for other areas of research and development that aren't even anything to do with cultivated meat, which is cool. That would also lower like financial support for animal ag and stuff. That's also good. So I guess we can move on to health now. I have some questions about the versions of cultivated meat that are 100% animal cells. So not the ones that are, part plant material, part animal material. So is it fair to say that these instances of 100% animal meat are like molecularly identical to specific kinds of meat we see on the shelves? And if that's the case, is there any reason to think that we should need health outcome data on these products before extrapolating like their health concerns onto like conventionally grown meat?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the assumption would be, I mean, for all intents and purposes, yes, like you're basically creating meat as we know meat to be. There's going to be some minor differences, like, B12 is not produced in the bioreactor by these cells natively, so you're going to have to add that in if you want that in your product. But I think as a whole, yes, most things that we know about meat, most attributes, etc., are going to be very similar to conventional meat. We do need data on that, though. So I think that is something that the research community needs to publish on, bioavailability, digestibility, amino acid composition, lipid composition. But some of the early studies, I mean, we started collecting some of this data that's in the published literature, as well as in the FDA documentation. This is all sort of in there. But amino acid composition, lipid composition seem to be very similar to conventional meat. Which from a nutritional standpoint, I think is favorable. We can talk about how you might want to be able to tune the lipid composition to be more quote unquote healthy. I think that's all in the cards. But in the short term, I think the goal of this industry is to basically make, a mostly nutritional, functional match to conventional meat, but minus like some of the bad things, like no antibiotics, no heavy metals in the seafood, for instance, no foodborne illness, that sort of thing.
Okay, so do you think that saturated fat and cholesterol could like be lowered without compromising the taste, for example?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the challenges. Lipids can oxidize, and so if you want to like add threes in there, for instance, I mean, you can do that. Like you have control over the process. There's actually some papers already that show that you can change the lipid profile of cultivated fat based on what you feed it. But yeah, I think that is going to happen where you're be able to create meats that have less saturated fats and higher degrees of polyunsaturated fats, or added EPA, DHA in there, etc.
Gotcha. Do you know if the saturated fat typically in meat, in cultivated meat, could be made to be like stearic acid, which is a kind of saturated fatty acid that we see in like chocolate and coconut? Do you know if like that could be a thing, or?
Yeah. So in some of the like lipidomics profiling that is in these papers, they break it down into those individual subtypes, and so I don't know the data off the top of my head, but I imagine, like I said, I think it should be controllable. It's just a matter of like figuring exactly what's going to control those pathways. But it might take some time to really figure out how to like tune it exactly how you want it every single time, type of thing. But yeah, there's already data showing that you can adjust lipid profiles based on what you're feeding those cells.
Got you. Okay, and do you think this would contain heme iron similar to, say, like red meat, like a cultivated beef, for example?
Yeah, so I'm not like an expert on this, but I think like heme iron is what's found in myoglobin, right? Essentially, so myoglobin levels in cell culture tend to be lower than what's found in a living animal. but that too can likely be tuned. For instance, if you grow cells in like a hypoxic condition, so lacking oxygen, that'll make those cells want to increase the abundance of myoglobin because it carries oxygen. And so also whether or not you're going to be differentiating those cells. So basically, if you're making muscle tissue, you can make really nice fibers, but it takes a longer time to do that. And so it might have added costs, etc. But that process itself of making those sort of mature fibers should also increase myoglobin expression. So I think, depending on the product, there's probably going to be some myoglobin, heme iron present, especially I think if you want to meet color expectations that can help of the end product. But it could be, again, tunable, because I'm aware like heme iron's been linked to different, cancer in red meat, for instance. So I think, some of these companies like Mark Post that founded Mosa Meat and Uma Valetti that founded Upside Foods, they're cardiologists. So they actually care quite a bit about, saturated fat content and some of these other things that are linked to health effects in meat consumption. So I think you will see maybe some companies think about that. But I do think it's a little bit of a longer, like it's not at the top of the priority list, I think, for these companies at this stage.
Got you. In regards to the cancer stuff, I mean, like, like processed meat by the IARC is considered to be a group 1 carcinogen, which means carcinogenic to humans. And then I think red meat, like unprocessed red meat, is group 2A, which is probably carcinogenic to humans. So do you think these, I guess we'll say traits of unprocessed red meat and then processed meat could be extrapolated onto certain forms of cultivated meat? Like, for example, I don't know, like processed cultivated meat or something like that, or even just let's say red meat, but that is cultivated. Would that be considered a 2A carcinogen?
I mean, for the processed meats, that has to do mostly with like nitrates and nitrites, right? I mean, I don't actually know what is the functional purpose of adding those in, and whether it's sort of like preservative, right? So, I don't know if you need to do that to the same extent with cultivated meat. I'm not an expert in like food processing or anything, but theoretically these products are sterile. So if any of those preservatives are there to prevent spoilage or things like that, then you could probably use far fewer quantities of them would be my guess. But I'm not actually sure.
Gotcha. And for something like just say unprocessed red meat, if you made a form of cultivated beef, for example, which is red meat, would we probably need to wait for the health outcome data to come out to say that, oh, this is also probably carcinogenic or, group 2A carcinogen? It's probably going to be a different thing. I would think. I'm not sure.
I mean, I would operate under the assumption that like if you're eating 100% cultivated meat product that comes on the market, that it would have similar health and nutritional attributes as conventional beef. So if whatever good or bad those are, then it's probably going to be mapped on, and then differences are probably going to be mostly on the margins, I would think.
Gotcha.
But maybe some of those marginal differences could have larger effects in different attributes, but I would operate on the assumption that they're kind of similar. Yeah.
Got you. And someone asked with like the risk of they said, will the risk of Salmonella, E. coli, and other parasites be non-existent or reduced with cultivated meat? And if it is reduced, does this mean that this meat can be safely cooked at a lower temperature than, say, meat from animals?
It's a good question. I think the answer is like strongly, high confidence that you'd have reduction in foodborne illness. I think, essentially if a contamination happens, your whole batch is spoiled. Like it's very easy to detect. So it's you'll never like have something come off the production line that's contaminated for cultivated meat. But with that said, like from packaging to arriving to the consumer, there could be holes that occur in the packaging, and bacteria can populate that way. So there still can be foodborne illness from a contamination event that occurs during shipping and handling and that sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind. But for sure that the incidence should be dramatically lower. What was the other part of the question?
They said, and if this is the case, that this risk can go down, does it also mean that cultivated meat can be safely cooked at a lower temperature?
Yeah, so I think one of the implications of cultivated meat that's interesting is that you might not have to ship food like seafood on ice, or frozen, for instance. So the cold chain for agricultural meat transport could be dramatically shifted in a future where cultivated meat is very abundant. So that's sort of interesting because that's further reduction in your sort of scope 3 emissions or carbon footprint of and also you can get like seafood wherever, like fresh seafood wherever, which is cool. Cooking temperature, I guess my guess would be yes. I mean to the extent that the cooking is cooking the actual meat for textural and flavor properties like the Maillard reaction, that sort of thing. But what I'd say is that you're probably not going to see USDA or other regulators make changes to those guidelines anytime soon.
Yeah.
So even if you theoretically you could scientifically maybe do that without any harm, the regulators are certainly not going to recommend it. I think would be my guess.
Probably be a generally good idea just to not, in the case that someone confuses the two, and then starts cooking real meat.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, and do you think, I mean, this is probably more of a speculative answer, but do you think that cultivated meat will be considered an ultra-processed food when it's brought to scale on the market?
Yeah, so there's different classifications for processing, right? From my understanding, different ways to do it. I'm sort of outside of my direct area of expertise, so I don't know the answer to that. I think it will depend on the product and some of the processing methods that are done post-harvest. So, I mean, if you're making certain products, you're using typical food processing things like an extruder, like a food extruder, the chopping, the mixing equipment that you use in the conventional meat industry is all, basically what you'd find at the end of the line in the facility, cultivated meat manufacturing plant. So to the extent that those correspond to how those classifications are made, then you could see similar classifications, but I'm actually not exactly sure.
Gotcha. Okay. So someone asks, is there anything individual people can do to speed up cultivated meat coming to market at scale? Just what can individual people do, if anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole subject is really interdisciplinary. So, from a career perspective, if this is something that you care about and you're interested in, I think there's ways that you can get involved. Even if you're not a scientist, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the other side of things, marketing, thinking about, how do we sell this product, doing environmental analyses, all these sorts of things, communication. On a practical level, I think in the short term, adoption of new technologies happens a lot by word of mouth. So that's how innovations diffuse throughout society. So talking about it to your friends and family, I think, is important. Giving them good information, that sort of thing, will be important in the short term.
Sharing this interview.
You can share this interview.
Yeah.
You can donate to organizations like GFI. We're entirely backed by philanthropy, and dollars that come from individuals is what powers our work. And I do think we do have an outsized impact for, we punch above our weight in terms of the work that we do. So that's one way I think people can make a difference. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So that's basically all the questions I wanted to ask. And now there's just two bonus ones that, I don't even know if I'll keep it in. It might be out of your area of expertise, but someone said, how do you view the future of cultivated meat as being affected by AI, and what processes of production can be allocated to AI? So do you know anything about that, or is that more out of your area?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people that do computational sciences, AI, machine learning, we get this question a lot, like, how can I contribute? And so yeah, I might recommend checking out a group called the Cultivated Meat Modeling Consortium. They're a group of like computer modelers that want to apply these techniques to advance cultivated meat in various ways. So for AI applications, basically, there's no. A lot of people come to us. Like we've had scientists at Google come to us and other things. Like, what can we work on? We have like blue sky freedom to work on something. Can you give us something to work on? And the problem is there's no like big data sets that are like publicly available that you can just like tap into right now. But hopefully those data are going to be generated over time. And I think one of the applications is bioreactor optimization and process optimization. So basically these bioreactors, these tanks, are equipped with different sensors that are monitoring various different things from pH to temperature, oxygen levels, metabolite levels in the medium, etc. Right now, the way we do things is very slow. So we might take samples every couple of samples a day. So you're only getting like a couple of data points a day. But I think what we need to move into is basically getting many data points like every single minute. And then so you're generating very large data sets that then you can apply these sorts of machine learning techniques to optimize process conditions. So that's one way that you might think about applying AI. Others are for like taste and sensory aspects. So there's actually just a paper that was published that in Science, I think, that was basically able to predict the smell of a molecule and how it would how the human would sort of sense that. Which is really powerful because what we're trying to do here, especially with other alternative protein products like those that are derived from plants, that might not have all of the composition that you want. You have to have a mix of things to get the sort of volatiles, the smell, the cooking correct. So we need to understand the science of that more broadly, and I think AI can play a role there as well. So those are like two areas at least.
Yeah, that's awesome. You gave more of an answer than I expected. So I guess the last one is just, are you educated on the current state of cultivating dairy using the same methods? And if so, how far along is that?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, what's cool about this technology is you can cultivate anything that's a cell. So people are making like foie gras, like for instance, from growing liver cells. It's not just meat, muscle, fat, etc. So one of the other ways that people are using this technology is to culture mammary cells that will produce and secrete milk. So there are companies that are doing that for right now human milk, since the infant sort of nutrition formula market, I think, needs help. Like it's a good, it's a high price market that you can enter into, etc. Progress there, I think, is a little bit behind where we are cultivated meat. There's fewer companies. There's less dollars that have been invested. But fundamentally, the principles are sort of the same. You need to grow a lot of cells. In this case, you're probably fixing the cells to like a scaffold. So you're basically keeping these mammary cells alive. You're stimulating them to secrete something. Then you're sort of collecting that in a fluid that comes out. So it's a different way of sort of growing the cells and making the product, and that will require, I think, some additional innovation that it's just not how we've grown things in the past. So I think it's a little bit probably things to learn, but that's sort of currently where I understand it. I don't think you're close to really seeing like a cultivated milk product on the market anytime soon, to my knowledge. Maybe before the end of this decade, I would hope we could maybe get there. With that said, there's precision fermentation companies that are making individual milk proteins like lactoferrin or whey and that sort of thing. So some of those products are already on the market, and more of those will be entering the market soon. And those are more like functional ingredients, or in the case of lactoferrin, like a nutritional enhancement that can be added to a variety of different products.
Great. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I've had myself some of the vegan whey from that one company, California.
Perfect Day
or something. Yeah, Perfect Day. I think that's where they sourced it from or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, well, that was all the questions I had, and you answered all of them very comprehensively, and really appreciate you coming on. Is there anything else you want to say, like a closing statement, or where we can find you? Stuff about GFI, maybe. I know you're.
Yeah, I mean, I try to appreciate the opportunity to come and chat about these things. I do like longer form conversation to sort of, flesh out these ideas that people can hopefully have some solid information to go on and build on. But I try to be active on social media, so you can find me on Twitter. My handle is just at Elliot Swartz. I try to basically tweet only about cultivated meat. So if you're interested in staying up to date on the industry and other things that are, maybe important signals, you can follow me there. Friend me on LinkedIn. I'm also on there. And also, check out gfi.org if you're wanting to learn more about cultivated meat, other alternative proteins. We have a ton of different resources, for students, for people interested in policy, for a variety of different applications. All those materials are free and accessible. And so, I encourage you to go read and learn more.
Awesome. Well, I can vouch for you about your Twitter being very informative because, yes, he posts some very interesting stuff. And I basically stay up to date by seeing what you tweet. So it's very nice. But anyway, thanks again for coming on. And to the people watching, thanks for watching. Any comments, questions, just leave them below. I'm not sure if you have a YouTube account, but if you do, maybe you can answer something.
Not on YouTube too much, but
okay.
if there's other things that,
just
people feel strongly about something, you can tweet at me, or you can find my email as well. It's elliots@gfi.org. It's online, accessible, etc. So
awesome. Okay, guys. Well, again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.